Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my fine friends. Welcome to another episode of the Tom Petty Project podcast. This is the podcast that digs into the entire Tom Petty catalogue, song by song, album by album, and includes conversations with musicians, fans, and people connected with Tom along the way. I'm your host, Kevin Brown, and I'm joined once again by my co host, John Paulsen, for today's episode, which is a wrap up of Hard Promises. Thanks for joining me again, John. How are things with you?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here, and I believe that you are very high on this album. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it, especially for side A.
Right on. And I believe that since we last spoke, you attended a pretty big concert. How was that?
Yeah, Paul McCartney in Boston, which is the second time I've actually seen him this year. My son came down sick at the first show and did not have a very good time. So we were in Boston. We saw that Paul McCartney was playing there at Fenway, and we decided to get tickets to go and see him again. Just not so sure how long he'll be touring, so it was a great show. It's funny, he tells all the same stories from show to show,
Yeah.
and it got to be a running joke with me and my son, because he would go into a story and my son would just look at me and roll his eyes, but everybody else was enjoying the stories.
Well, that's the thing, right? He's playing for so many millions of people that there's always going to be probably at least half the crowd's never seen him before, or even more, maybe, right? And
Exactly.
Fenway Park must have been a fantastic place to go watch a gig because that's such an iconic, historic venue.
Yeah, that was my first time being there, and it's the this park itself is so old and just has so much history to it. But it was interesting walking in there after going to see him at SoFi Stadium, which is brand new. So it was definitely a dichotomy there between the two stadiums, and it was funny to see some other buildings around that can look in on the show, and they were all having a party and watching the concert from their rooftop bars or whatever. So it was a pretty cool scene.
Any highlights from it? Any songs that blew you away?
I mean, they have this portion for "I've Got a Feeling," which is one of my favorite Beatles songs, and apparently Peter Jackson was able to bring in the audio and some video from John Lennon's portion from the rooftop concert, so they're able to do a duet with him and Paul McCartney, and it's a treat, because it's cool to hear his voice come in as part of the show as well, because that song especially, it's the two of them kind of going back and forth with their different lyrics, and they kind of piece their two songs together to make that song, and it was towards the end of the show, so it was a nice way to sort of wrap things up.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, Queen. I went and saw Queen with Adam Lambert a few years ago, and they did the same thing with "Love of My Life." They brought Freddie in like as the vocal there, and I had the crowd and call and response kind of thing, which was it's super cool. And I think it can be cheesy, but if you do it right, it's also like you said, you get that voice sort of almost comes out of the blue, and you remind me, oh yeah, of course, love John.
Yeah, the way Paul set it up, it was, he told a story about Peter Jackson and the whole documentary that he did, and uh, set it up for the audience. So it wasn't like it was a surprise. It was kind of a
Okay,
surprise, but it was like they knew what to expect, but they were also like super excited about the way he described it. So
yeah,
it
that's
worked
awesome.
well.
Super cool. It's nice when you got friends like Peter Jackson who can do things like that for you, right?
Yeah, it's not bad.
Okay, let's dig into Hard Promises. I'll give you some sort of vital statistics about the album. So again, it's the second album on the Backstreet Records imprint. Recorded again at Sound City in Van Nuys and Cherokee Studios in Hollywood, with some additional recording at Goodnight Studio in LA. Again, it was produced by Jimmy Iovine and Tom Petty and engineered by Shelley Yakus, with a runtime of 39 minutes and 33 seconds. It was released on May 5th, 1981, and reached number 5 in the US chart, but it was again number 1 in New Zealand. All those Kiwis, they sure love their Petty. There were no leftover songs from these sessions that have turned up so far, with only Gator on the Lawn, which was the B-side from A Woman in Love, and obviously the original take of Stop Dragging My Heart Around, being the additional tracks from the album that we don't see in the track listing. So we also have a few additional musicians on this one. Obviously, Stevie Nicks and her sister Laurie Nicks did backing vocals on Insider, and she did vocals on You Can Still Change Your Mind. Sharon Solani did also backing vocals on You Can Still Change Your Mind. Then Duck Dunn comes on bass on A Woman in Love. Phil Jones added in some more percussion, and we get that single piano note from Bugs Wydell on Night Watchman. So let's go to the track listing, and we can discuss. So we said we were going to start with side 1, so I'll let you lead off.
Yeah, I think these first two tracks really are, merit discussion. They were both released as singles. The Waiting was obviously a huge hit for him, and it was the interesting thing about this when I was researching the track, and you probably ran across the same stuff, but he worked backward from the chorus. He usually works linear, apparently,
Yeah.
starting from the beginning of the song. And in this case, he had the chorus, and then having to try to get the verses and get the opening and all that. That must be a little frustrating. I guess he worked on it for a while, which makes sense. And the track's called "The Waiting," so it all sort of lines up. But I mean, I love the opening there. Baby, don't feel like heaven right now. Don't feel like something from a dream. It's just another indication or another case where he is able to grab the listener with a really good opening line and a lot of nostalgia there. And I also like I might have chased a couple women around. All it ever got me was down. That's another very memorable. This is a 10 for 10 song for me. Obviously, it ended up as a hit for him and ended up in the Greatest Hits album as well. Just definitely one that's a part of all my playlists. Just a great track.
And it's one of those that I always think that, again, even listen to it critically, it's a very simple song. It's a simple chord progression. There's not a lot of complexity in it. There's not a lot of real interplay between parts, but it's so well written. And, Paul Zolo asked Tom, any idea what makes a melody work? And Tom says, I think it's as simple as, can you hum it in your head? Does it do something to you when you hear it? Is it a friendly thing? Do you want to hear it again? Right? And so 4 for 4 in this song. Like, you don't need to overcomplicate things. If you can write a melody that pure and that beautiful, it just works every single time, right?
Yeah, and I think his vocal performance is maybe the most complex thing on the song. Like the way he's kind of getting the words out in a different tempo at different spots. But he had a knack for that. Like we saw that in previous tracks. Like his vocals are kind of underrated, I think, in terms of how he puts them out. But just a fantastic track. Great way to open the album.
Well, and one that I don't know if you came across this in your research too, but Jimmy Iovine was absolutely devastated that this didn't. Like, he thought this was going to be bigger than Refugee. He thought this is the song that's going to be, because he just loved it, which is why it obviously comes off as lead track. And you sort of agree that you would think that it's just made for radio, this one, right? You think it should have been an absolute smash. But, of course, Stop Dragging My Heart Around gets released right around the same time. And then that's what they thought took a little bit of steam, a little bit of wind out of the sails, possibly.
Yeah, I believe Mike Campbell was in an interview for the documentary and mentioned that Don't Stop Dragging My Heart Around. Stevie was so excited about how well the single was doing and saw him in a hotel, and he's like, oh, that just knocked our track right out of the water. So yeah, that probably is the reason why, because they weren't going to play, a lot of radio stations were going to play 2 Petty tracks at the same time at that point in his career, probably.
Exactly. I think that's probably the case. And so moving on to, you said like the first 2 tracks, especially Woman in Love. That's the one that I had when I was going through and did my the song episode. That's the one that I'd earmarked as just an absolute vocal tour de force. Like, that's Petty as a vocalist at his absolute peak to me, and I think it's as good as almost anything he did in his career, really.
Yeah, and it's the change of tempo too that I really like. He mentioned it in a quote about playing it live in a show. A lot of times it's very effective to just suddenly bring a roar to a whisper, and it always moves the audience. This is, to me, like, this is the first, I believe, biggish single that didn't make the Greatest Hits compilation. I'm always fascinated by what makes it, what didn't make it. And you could definitely argue it's one of a handful of tracks that you could argue should be on the Greatest Hits or could be on the Greatest Hits. I love the way that this song kicks off after the end of The Waiting. Like, it almost seems to me like these 2 songs were meant to be played together. Really, really nicely done, and just how it kicks off. And Duck Dunn's playing the bass. Tom is just singing over the bass part, and then you have Mike just kind of coming in and out, just as beautiful as he does, like knowing when to play, when not to play, and then it just explodes into this chorus. And the chords, Mike's chords hit and his guitar riffs hit. And it's tremendous. I probably give this an 8.5 or 9 out of 10. And I like, this is on all my Petty playlists. Basically, it's one of those kind of lost hits of his that maybe doesn't get as much airplay now, but at the time it was pretty big. And you could argue this should be on his the first Greatest Hits compilation.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's when you get Greatest Hits compilations, I'm always a little bit leery about new songs being on there, because it's a Greatest Hits, right? Like, and I mean, I know that we got Mary Jane's Last Dance, and no one's going to argue that should be on there. But Something in the Air as a cover, it's a great cover, but instead of this song, and there's probably a couple of others that we'll talk about before we get to Greatest Hits, I think you would say, well, I'd much rather have that on there than Something in the Air. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's a record company thing to get the diehard fans to buy the compilation.
Yeah.
When they probably already have all the albums that they have all these tracks on all the different albums. I still would probably have bought it even without any sort of new content on there, because I like to, especially in the record day age, it's nice to have them all in a one disc set or whatever, so that you can just play them in a row and not have to fiddle with your record player. But I definitely have some thoughts on the Greatest Hits compilation when we get to it.
Well, the other thing that I've mentioned in the episode, and I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are, when Dunn plays bass on this one, the couple of tracks are the tracks he's played before with the Heartbreakers, where you think, okay, yeah, well, that's a very distinctive bass line. That's, Ron Blair wouldn't play like that. And the song kind of needs that groove to it. But this one, this is a pretty straight up rocker. And in terms of sort of the bass line itself, it's not massively complex. It's keeping the root going pretty much. And I'm really curious why they brought him in for this one rather than Ron Blair playing it. And I wonder if it was anything to do with Ron sort of being in that transitional phase where he was sort of, heading his way out of the band. But again, you've also got Tom Petty, who plays a mean bass. So I'm really kind of curious. Maybe he was just around and they said, well, do you want to come and play on this one then? I wonder what the reason for that would be.
Yeah, and it's kind of speculation because we weren't there. And I think as you get further away from the recording of the album, the time period gets compressed when they're remembering their stories about things like, oh, this happened during these sessions, so maybe it happened for this reason. But this was, watching the documentary portion again for Hard Promises, this was the time when Ron was starting to, I think they said that, I think it was Mike or Tom that said they're pretty hard on people in the band if they're not playing the way that they want them to play or whatever. Yeah. And it was starting to catch up to Ron. And maybe this was a situation where he was like, okay, well, I don't want to play today. And so they had Duck Dunn there to fill in. That's not bad. That's not a bad fill-in.
Oh God, yeah, no kidding. It's funny. I mean, I was thinking about that too, like with artists who are hard on musicians or producers even, right? But it's that thing of, it's the same thing with Torpedoes when Iovines just caning Stan and making him take and take and take and take. But it's got to be the best. And that's sort of a signature thing throughout Tom's entire career. He never put anything out that he didn't feel was, top quality. And I think they even said in interviews, they said, we always tried to write, every single song, we tried to write the best song we could write every single time. And I mean, I think, you don't always hit that, but I think having that work ethic and that ethos is definitely, that's the way to greatness. And Ron clearly wasn't, he wasn't as fully invested in being the best of the best of the best at that time. So you could see where that collision might come into play, right?
Yeah, and I think it's cool that they eventually came back to him, or he came back to them.
Yeah.
And, they didn't hold any ill will at that point, and they needed a bassist, and it worked out well.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Night Watchman.
So why don't you talk about this? I know you love this side A. So why don't you talk about the rest of side A, and then I will give you my take on it.
Sounds good. Okay, the first thing that I really, really like about Night Watchman, and it's a geeky thing again, like I talk about song structure, right? So usually songs are, especially rock and roll songs, are verse, chorus, bridge, maybe a solo, and then chorus out, right? But this one's one of those ones where it flips it because the chorus comes in first. I'm a Night Watchman, I need security, all that kind of stuff. That's your chorus. So this one's B-A, B-A, C-B. So I like that for starters. I think that's just a really neat little thing to do. And then you've got one of the best drum tracks that Stan Lynch ever put on a Heartbreakers record to me. It's really, really subtle. It's very, very clever. And it's got that nice groove syncopation to it. And then you get that wonderful, Paul Zola called it spidery guitar lick from Mike. And then again, it's that first sort of step into really developing a character. And it's, obviously it comes from a real life conversation or conversations that Tom was having with his Night Watchman. So all those things combined, I think it just gives it a completely unique feel. And it doesn't sound like anything else they've done up to this point. I mean, not even close, right? It's so far away from everything else they've put out. So for those reasons, I absolutely adore this song.
Yeah, I like the guitar riff, the spidery guitar riff. So, revisiting this album, and especially, I guess maybe I got my expectations a little bit too high when you were saying it's your favorite side A.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what you said. It was something about your favorite side A of his catalog. I would say Damn the Torpedoes, and that doesn't even take into account Full Moon Fever, Wildflowers, etc. But of the Heartbreakers records, I would say this is these next three songs sort of surprised me a little bit. I wouldn't go crazy on them in terms of the ratings, but I thought Night Watchman, the guitar is really cool.
Yeah.
I think, and then you mentioned the story aspect of it, and then finding out that this was a guy that was, stationed at his house to just be security.
Yeah.
And he's out there talking to him. Imagine that. Like you're just, you're talking with Tom Petty and he's the only one up at the house and you're having chats with him on a nightly basis. That'd be pretty cool. I think I did some overnight security for the Chicago Bears training camp when I was in college.
Oh, no way.
That midnight. Yeah, I'm a Packer fan too. So they held it at UW Platteville in Wisconsin. But that midnight to 6 a.m. Shift is rough because you're just by yourself. You have the occasional groupie trying to break into the dorm where the players are staying, and you have to deal with that. But it's pretty lonely out there. So maybe it just kind of brought back some bad memories, lonely memories of mine. That's why I didn't like it as much as you did.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, anybody who's never worked a night shift, it is a really odd thing because your body's all out of whack. Like you said, it's so quiet. I was my time in the military. I served a bit of time in Northern Ireland, and when you're doing sentry duty over there, same thing. You're sort of sitting in this tower, watching nothing happen for hours and hours and hours and hours, right? But then when something does happen, it's like, oh, so it's 99% pure boredom, 1% sheer terror, right? So I think that's more sort of night watchman or security kind of jobs is essentially the same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is also bringing back a memory because I would usually sit there on the bench outside the dorm and I would be reading my fantasy football magazines. And this is my first, I would have 3 or 4 of them and I would read them all through the night. So that was like my first research for what ended up being my career. So I guess that's pretty funny too.
So talking about, story building and characters and that kind of thing, something big. Then we're heading into that. This is the first time where Tom really gets into storytelling mode. We end up with Spike, we end up with lots of other stories, but this was the first one really. I think I can't remember which song it is off the first album now. It's going to annoy me. There's another one where it's kind of getting Wild One Forever, where it gets into a little bit, but this is the one really where it's a narrative. So that's what I love about this song. And then I wanted to ask you about Speedball. So I'd always sort of read this as Speedball is the character who's working on something big. But I was having a conversation with someone online about it, and they see it. No, they think that the character who's working on something big isn't named, and Speedball is sort of a peripheral character who comes in and is almost kind of the one who screws everything up, which I found like an interesting angle. And I thought, I hadn't thought about that. So I'm going to have to been going back to it and thinking about this song more. And I think it's again that Tom had such an ability to write things clearly, but leave enough ambiguity in there so that you could really sort of take things any way you wanted to. So thoughts on
I'd have to revisit that to sort of listen for that again. I didn't catch that. I really like the groove on it. Tom did say that it was one of his first attempts at really writing a story with characters. And as you mentioned, this is like 2 in a row here with a character. Yeah. Nice organ from Benmont. I like that quite a bit. And does the main character die in the end? Is that the finishing? It's a little bit of a downer maybe.
It's that thing though, and again, that's left open to interpretation. The maids are talking, they find him on the still made bed, but it's not explicit that he's actually dead. But really, to me, that's the only inference you can draw from it. So again, I think if anyone ever wants to make a Tom Petty themed Hollywood drama movie, this would be a great little plot line to hang your story around and all the characters around, right?
Yeah, for sure. I would give both Night Watchman and Something Big a 6 out of 10. So that's where I'm at with them.
6.
It might be a little harsh.
Whoa.
Might be a little harsh for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd do both of them as 10s. I'd have to.
Wow.
I think I might have gone 10 on both, just because I think sonically and musically, I did. and again, I tend to overrate this album, I think probably, but sonically, musically, and lyrically, and vocally, everything. What I start from, and I think we talked about this before, I start from a point of, what am I going to criticize? Where do I take things away rather than saying, rather than starting from a 5 and working up? I tend to start from 10 and work down is what I try to do. But I will accept that maybe they're not as good as the first 2 tracks, but to me, they're just, I wouldn't change a single note in either of them,
Hey, if you love it, you love it.
Absolutely.
Art is subjective. Music is subjective. We're okay.
Yeah, and talking about subjective and overrating thing, King's Road. So King's Road to me, again, I talked ad nauseum, probably too much in the episode about this, about its place in my history growing up. And sort of when I got stationed in London, as I was a pretty young man, and I come from a working class town, and suddenly you're thrown into the sort of the bright lights of one of the biggest cities on the planet, you know. And I'm also stationed in Chelsea, which is one of the richest areas of London, and the place where we're going to go drinking every weekend is the King's Road, where, you know, you've got film stars and athletes and models and all these kinds of people milling around. So it's this weird displacement of some scruffy kid from a coal mine in town walking past, you know, David Bowie and Iman and all these different people. So I've got that real strong connection to the King's Road. And again, the lyric is, it's fun, it's a jaunty, bouncy, upbeat, you know, I hope we would call it a banger. And so all those sort of elements combined just make it like a really, really sentimental favorite for me.
Yeah, one of my notes is upbeat, kind of a banger. And that I had to go look up King's Road and what it was. Like, I didn't, you know, I'm not from there. I didn't know what it was, and then figured it out. I thought it was interesting knowing that he wrote King's Highway later on in his career, that he had a King's Road earlier in his career. And I was trying to figure, you know, was that related at all? It wasn't. But it sounds like a really interesting street or area.
Oh yeah, it's, I mean, all through the sort of 50s and 60s, it's like with Carnaby Street and maybe sort of oh goodness gracious, Camden Market. It's one of the sort of the cultural hotspots in London. And so there's a very famous soccer player named George Best, who, as good as, or I would argue maybe even better than Pele, but he was Northern Irish, so he never played at the World Cup, so didn't really get the same kind of level of exposure. But he was also a bit of a partier and a fashion guru, so he had a boutique on the King's Road that he'd opened with some friends of his. And so you get up, this is where the kind of this thing started, where culturally a lot of famous people started gravitating towards this place. It was also back in the day where all the major fashion stores were, and again, just like and I think there was even like a Bentley outlet store there. There was all sorts of places there where money sort of drifted and gathered around the King's Road. So just culturally, it's a really important part of London's history, and certainly Chelsea's history.
Yeah, and I would say that with Petty too, they sort of broke in the UK before they broke here, and it's cool that he's sort of giving them a nod with a track on his fourth album that's basically London centric. So pretty cool. Absolutely. Pretty cool track. I gave it a 6 out of 10. Again, I think it's solid. I wouldn't, skip it, but I'm not seeking it out either.
Okay. No playlists? Not on one of your playlists?
I don't know if it made any of my playlists. I did add one, but I'll talk a little bit later that I sort of discovered during this re-listen of Hard Promises.
Yeah, I think it's always I think it's probably one of the top 5 in most of my playlists, because I'm listening to Tom Petty. I want to listen to King's Road. So I think the other song we were going to talk about, and then we have to talk about, is definitely his Insider.
Yes.
Again, the lyrics, according to Tom, were written pretty quickly. And it was one of those he'd written, or Stevie Nicks had asked him to write a song. This was the song that he wrote, but then sort of realized that I don't really think I can give this one to Stevie. I have to keep this one. But of course, brings her back in because it is a duet. And it's funny because it's not a schmaltzy, you take one verse, I take another verse. It's not that kind of crappy ballad that you sometimes get in rock music. It's just a beautifully sort of complementary dual vocal. And it's funny how some people just naturally fit together, right? Like, even you get great singers come together sometimes, it just doesn't quite work. Either there's not chemistry, or there's something tonally about the voices that don't blend. But these two, I mean, they're just absolutely made for each other vocally.
Yeah, and I guess what happened was when he was trying to teach her how to sing it, she was always sort of just singing along and not taking sort of the lead vocal on it. I mean, there's not really a lead. He's singing. You can hear him more than you can hear her, but she's always there, present. Yeah. And then he just started to like it the way it was being sung, and basically pulled it back and said, I can't give this to you. And she was totally cool with it. This isn't a great example of, I would call them a mid-tempo song. He calls it a ballad. He says that they didn't really release ballads as singles until Free Falling, which is quite a bit later. And this is just sort of an underrated track because it just didn't get much radio airplay. Even Tom Petty fans that I know don't know this song very well. They're not digging into Hard Promises and listening to the side 2 over and over again. So they may not know this one. And he plays it in concert once in a while, and it's sort of a mixed reaction in terms of who knows it and who doesn't know, doesn't recognize the track. So what I'm getting at is, this is maybe the first, or I don't know, second of Surrender, but that Surrender didn't make an album at this point. But when these kind of slower tracks that weren't released as singles and just woefully underrated, like just incredible how good this song is, and they sang so well together, and it was sort of a sign of things to come. I love this track. I mean, I give it a 9 or a 10 out of 10. Definitely on all my playlists with him and his playlists, and just an incredible track.
Well, as you said, like, it wasn't released as a single, and I think that's one of the few. And as we get into Producer Per Day, it's one of the few times where I think that that's just the wrong decision. Because to me, if you release that song, it's a surefire number one, or certainly it would be getting tons and tons of airplay. Because again, you've got Stevie Nicks, who, as we talked about, was kind of at the height of her powers. Fleetwood Mac was huge, late 70s, early 80s, right? I mean, you've got this duet, if you want to sort of push that angle where you can leverage her popularity as well as Tom's, the success of Damn the Torpedoes. If you release that as either the second or third track from the album, I think it lands really hard.
Yeah, maybe you release it after Stop Dragging My Heart Around, Knock Her Off. The chart is payback.
Bring it back.
Yeah. I mean, I think later on in his career, they released quite a few ballads. I mean, we'll talk about a bunch of them as we go on. And at some point there was a shift, like, oh yeah, these are really good songs too that can be hits, and we should definitely release them.
Absolutely. Okay, so you said there was one other song that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, the closing track. Yeah, the closing track, You Can Still Change Your Mind. And this is one that sort of came out as I listened to it over a few times, and the space there, again, we have this weird spacey intro. I don't know if you have a thought about that, but it kind of threw me off at the start, but then it just kind of goes into a typical petty ballad, slow, like pensive song. And I love closing albums with that sort of vibe. I think it's the fourth best song on the album after The Waiting, A Woman in Love, and Insider. So I added it to my Dogs with Wings box set playlist, and it's definitely one I want to seek out a little bit more. But that intro throws me. It's almost like they just wanted to put something out that says, yes, we know how to use a synthesizer. We're choosing not to, but here's a little taste if you really want to hear some synth. I don't know, but the track's really good, and I like the vocals. You really kind of have to listen to them, but Stevie Nicks sings back up on this one as well, and they sound so great together.
Yeah, and it's a Mike Campbell composition, right? Like, the musically it was, and again, one that you think not necessarily the one you would pick out as a Mike Campbell tune, because he tends to leans into the rock side of things more, or certainly those are the ones that Tom connects with. But this one, no, I totally agree. Now, the intro with this one, I agree. Like, again, you just think, why are we padding out space with this? But at least it's not as long as Louisiana Rain.
Yes.
You know what I mean? At least it doesn't go on for quite as long as it's not a minute. So I can live with this one. It doesn't upset me quite as much as the other ones, but yeah, it's an odd choice, definitely. And especially with Benmont, because I was thinking about that, because Benmont's an organ player and was quite a purist about, he didn't like using too many sort of gadgets and gizmos. Like, he can make the album sound the way it sounds, and he can make the organ sound the way it sounds. He controls the Leslie when he's playing with his Leslie. He controls all those kinds. They're not doing that in post, right? So to have those sort of synthy bits in there, which again, I mean, other than Don't Come Around Here No More and some stuff off Long After Dark, there's not a ton of synth in Tom Petty's music. So I wonder, It just seems so incongruous to have them on two really rock and roll albums. They are these, Hard Promises, Damn the Torpedoes, they're rock and roll albums, so they just don't quite fit, and I don't know why they're there. Yeah,
I would love, and this is a great example of just being a fly on the wall when they're making these decisions, and like how much thought went into that. Like, as you mentioned, just not a lot of synth on any of his records. They were very much a band that wanted to sound timeless, and they didn't jump in with the fads very often. So it was a curious choice, but the track itself stands up, and I think it overcomes it. It is definitely something that throws you off, though, when it comes on a playlist, because you're like, what's this? Oh yeah, this is the opening to You Can Still Change Your Mind.
But yeah, and a great closer, as you said. I mean, again, I like that too. I want either one of two things. I either want something that's going to really sort of mellow me out and just drop me back into place. Okay, that is excellent. Or just thrash your balls off, right? Something that's either one end of the extreme or the other. And I love that this one sort of has that drop off where you just think, okay, well, again, it's softer. It's not quite got that bite on the guitars. They've kind of backed a lot of that stuff off. The vocal attack isn't there. It's much more even in sort of that delivery. So yeah, perfect closer for me. Okay, we should talk about our top three, and I know we're going to differ on this. And I've done this in like I've done this a certain way. I've gone with my favorite three rather than what I think the top three songs are. So my favorite three are the three albums that are three songs that go on my EP are The Waiting. That has to be there. Something Big, because again, I just absolutely love that song to death, and Insider, because it's just again so strong. Now, if I was going with the strongest three, then I would drop out Something Big and I would put in A Woman in Love. I would definitely those would be my three if I was doing it that way.
So yeah, I would where I landed. So I went The Waiting, I would say Insider second, and then A Woman in Love third. And it to me, these three are head and shoulders above the rest of the album in my opinion. So not a hard decision for me. I think the big decision is, what's number two after The Waiting, but I think Insider stands above A Woman in Love.
Okay, I'm playing producer for a day. When going through this, this was, because I think on the first three albums, I've subbed out one song and put something else in. And I think, as much as anything, just out of mischief, right? You want to create a talking point on your podcast. And but for this one, there certainly isn't anything I could really drop. When I went through the track listing, the only song, like if I was going to bring in the studio version or the original version of Stop Dragging My Heart Around without Stevie Nicks' vocals, and we didn't talk about that song. Obviously that was a song that they'd recorded and was intended for this album, but when Tom decided to keep Insider, he then gave Stop Dragging My Heart Around to Stevie, and she just overdubbed vocals on top of the track that was already finished and sort of in the can. So, but I really like that version without her vocal. I love it with her vocal, but I like the version without her vocal too. So the only thing I might do is add that in. And if you would have sort of put a gun to my head and tell me that I have to take one track off to put one in, then the only one I could stand to lose on this album is The Criminal Kind. And it's not because I think it's a weak track or I don't like it, but I like it least out of the 10. So when I went through it, my sequencing was, the side one as is. I didn't change a damn thing. Side two, I opened with Insider because I would have preferred to see them start off with the strongest side song there and then go Think About You, Letting You Go, The Criminal Kind, Stop Dragging My Heart Around, and You Can Still Change Your Mind to close. So I know I've broken the sort of the vinyl time limits there, but if we're going to just do it this philosophically and sort of, okay, well, we can do anything we like, I would go with 11 on the album, and that's the way I think I would do it.
Yeah, and I would just say that when we look at the Hard Promises, and you're higher on the album than I am, but when we look at it from this viewpoint way in the future, knowing that Stop Dragging My Heart Around came out of these sessions, I think we have to sort of look at it, the album a little bit differently, because if that had been included on the album, it would have been a giant hit, and you could maybe argue that the top 3 or 4 songs are up there with Damn the Torpedoes. You could make that case.
Yeah.
So I probably, me, I like to get the good stuff up front.
Yeah.
And if I would like you to do this exercise is maybe just put The Waiting, A Woman in Love, and then Insider, those 3 in a row, and listen to them. I think Insider really follows up A Woman in Love really well.
Okay.
And so just listen to those 3 and see if that would change your mind at all on side A. I know you love side A, but that was my one pitch. And then, I don't know that they can take ownership over Stop Dragging My Heart Around. I do like that it did make some of the greatest hits compilations and stuff later on.
Yeah.
But putting that on the album, I think that would be a good one to start side 2 with, or maybe you put it somewhere in side A. I didn't put a lot of thought into the producer of a day because I think this is sequenced pretty well.
Yeah.
The only thing I thought of was maybe Insider third after The Waiting and A Woman in Love.
And so as a sort of, we always talk about once we've gone through these things, and I knew that Insider was going to be on side 1 for your producer video. I just knew that was happening. I think as an album, though, we talked about it with Damn the Torpedoes. Torpedoes was the first album where it sounded like a really cohesive album rather than a set of 10 songs. And I think that Hard Promises took everything that it did well on Damn the Torpedoes and really locked it in. Like, this is, production-wise, this album sounds phenomenal. Like, Jimmy I is probably one of Jimmy Iovine's top 4 or 5 albums sonically that he ever produced. Damn the Torpedoes will be in there as well. And so sort of, I like that when I put it on and listen to the album as a whole, and I tend to listen to this album a lot as an album, probably more than anything other than Wildflowers, I would say, maybe, or maybe Last DJ. So those are sort of the 3 that I listen to as an album most frequently. It just all fits to me. Again, like you said, the sequencing is great. Like the bounce of everything, the way that the songs change pace, everything sort of, it's just settled to me. It just works so well, and that's why I love this album so much. Is because of the overall feel of it.
Yeah, I think part of my not wanting to change a whole lot um, is that we're past the point where he broke out and had the huge album, and you don't necessarily have to have all your best songs on side A and
Yeah,
try to really grab the fan or the DJ and try to get him to play your music, because they're going to play it regardless. So I think he's earned that right to sort of sequence it the way he wants to.
I agree. And so yeah, you sort of sent me a pitch to say that we should be putting Insider on as track 3, and I'm gonna, when I create the playlists, I will definitely give that a good listen and see how it feels. It'd be really weird though, hey, because when you listen to an album with 5-10 seconds of the song to go, your brain's already saying, well, I know what comes next, and before that first chord of the next song, it's already there in your mind, right? With albums that you love and albums that you know.
Yeah, and this is especially one for you. You love side A so much that this is going to test you as much as it possibly can.
So, but where would you put this one then in sort of the entire catalog? We always try and do that. And not to say we're not ranking, obviously, but roughly where does it sit for you?
I think it's important on a number of levels. I think it's a solid follow-up to Damn the Torpedoes, especially if you think about the fact that Stop Dragging My Heart Around came out of the sessions. I think that really, I think if you're just a kind of a casual fan, you might say, oh, this wasn't as good as Damn the Torpedoes, but knowing that a number one hit came out of it for Stevie might change your mind a little bit on that. I think it did what it needed to do in terms of it wasn't just like a thrown together, you're going to get it type album. Like they took their time with it, and it sounds good. It sounds great, as you mentioned. And I think it's sort of, things start to decline a little bit, but there's this series of albums here, and we're going to talk about them. They all have at least one big hit on them. They have another like minor hit or kind of medium hit, and they all have a really good album track that's really at least one that's just totally overlooked. And it's sort of a situation that he got into for the next few albums before Full Moon Fever. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that too, but he was a little bit of a crossroads there.
Yeah.
He was still knocking out good albums and hits, but maybe not as big as Damn the Torpedoes. So I think we're sort of it's really a good follow-up to Damn the Torpedoes, especially when you take into account that Stop Dragging Your Heart. I don't want to keep repeating myself, but that track would have been the biggest hit on this album if it had been included. So I think we just have to sort of underline that when looking at it within his catalog.
Yeah, absolutely. And we didn't talk about the B-side, Woman in Love, Gator on the Lawn, which again, to me, I was going to mention to you, I was listening to it again this morning, and it's got it's obviously that sort of, Carl Perkins, Chet Atkins, real sort of old 50s sort of rock and roll, rootsy kind of stuff that Tom would have been listening to, like Elvis and that kind of stuff. So it sits in that part of his musical background. But when I listen to the sort of the rhythm of it and the way the guitar's picked, it's got a lot of similarities to some of the stuff they would go on to do with the Wilburys. So again, those influences sort of come through, and you can see it's nice to see that those influences were already there for Tom, and maybe he brought some of that stuff to the Wilburys rather than, because you'd assume that was Orbison or Harrison bringing that sort of stuff in. But no, Tom Petty had a lot of love for that kind of music. So I love that song. It's just a fun, like you said, it's just them probably just messing around. Maybe that's just even a one take Jake vocal where he just was horsing around in the studio and then, I know what, let's keep that. That's a good B-side.
Yeah, I'm glad they kept it around, and it ended up in the playback box set as well.
Yeah.
And I do think it was them goofing around. I think the other thing I wanted to mention was that he didn't like the cover art to this album. He mentioned it was kind of boring. It was, in a record store. But I think when you look back, and this is the album where the record company wanted to raise the price to $9.98, and they wanted to make more money off of Tom Petty, his popularity, and he fought them and to keep it at $8.98. And didn't want his fans to think that he was the one that was okay with this price increase. They're gonna, not like him for that. And so the fact that he's got a photo in a record store, I thought was a little bit. It would be even funnier if it's, there were records on there that said $9.98 or $8.98 or something. But I think that sort of actually really works given the what was going on at the time, because there was a lot of stress in his life regarding that, and he still knocked out this album and was fighting his record company yet again. On the pricing. So very interesting background to this album.
When it's funny too on the pricing thing, which we didn't. I'm glad we brought that up because if we'd omitted that, we would have been we'd have had to come back on and splice that in somewhere. So, but it's that thing about I like too that he'd said that to me it was obvious that we had to fight this because you're just screwing the fans over for no good reason. And he said I thought that all my sort of colleagues would follow me, and no one did. So a lot of the other fans when they did raise them to $9.98, I was like, oh yeah, whatever. But Petty was sort of the lone voice in no, we do this for the fans, right? So, and I think that. I think it's part of his legacy and part of his legend, right? I think that really sort of cemented him as the man of the people. This is the guy who's on our side.
Yes, and I think that endeared him to the fans even more. And like as you mentioned, I was going to mention the same thing. Legacy. It's just part of his. It didn't last long. Like the record company was like, okay, we're going to back down this. We'll just raise it for somebody else. And they did. But it wasn't Petty's album, and he wasn't the one seen going up. And he is known now as fighting the record company, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and it's not just a, it's not a sort of an ego thing, and it's not a, it's not a grandstanding move, because you do see that with acts sometimes where you think, well, this is PR now, because when you've got PR agents involved, they're doing this just to get that kudos. Well, this was genuinely Tom saying, no, this is not right. Like, that's too much, and it's only an extra $1. And in today's terms, you think, well, an extra $1, who cares? Like, a difference of $8.98 and $9.98, whatever. But back in the day when you don't have streaming services and you do have to buy all your music, you only get to buy. I remember growing up as a teenager, and you would have been the same, buying cassettes or buying CDs, or whatever. You only got so much budget, so that $1 could make a difference. Certainly in terms of being able to buy 3 or 4 instead of 1 or 2, or
Yeah, I never, like, as a fan, I never felt like I was getting gouged by him, and it's just kind of this sort of like fighting for the fans thing. He made a lot of money off of his fans and had a very great life because of it. But like every dollar I spent on a show or any kind of merchandise or whatever, I felt like I was getting my money's worth because of where it was priced relative to everybody else.
Yeah,
he was always slower to raise his prices on his tickets than everybody else. I think he was reluctant to do that for this reason. But I think in certain situations, third party people would get a hold of his tickets, then resell them. So he was always trying to find ways within the fan club to get his really good tickets, really good seats for his shows. He wanted those going to people that maybe couldn't afford to, buy it from a third party. So I think this sort of translated throughout his career as a sort of one of those arcs of his legacy, is that he was always fighting for the fans.
Absolutely. And we love him for it. Okay. So we can probably wrap up there, I think, unless you have any final thoughts. Oh no, we were going to do something that I totally forgot about there. So as listeners will know, that every week I give you a petty trivia question, and we haven't been doing that in the album wraps. So what I thought we'd do is I sort of threw it over to John and said, well, you write a trivia question, you can throw it at me, and then I'll try to answer it, and I'll probably edit out my answer if I get it right, just so that we can throw that out there, and then we'll do it that way, because I think that would be a lot of fun. So John, you have a petty trivia question prepped for me.
All right, I will say that I have not listened to every single one of your podcasts. So if I give you a trivia question that you've already asked, then we're going to have to edit this again.
Okay.
But here's my trivia question for you. You Come Through, recorded for the Let Me Up, I've Had Enough sessions, features which famous rocker on the drums and bass, which he added in 1995, several years later than the original recording, for the release of the playback box set?
Well, that's a great question. And as it happens, I do know the answer. So I will edit it out, and I'll put a bleep here. Maybe that's what I'll do. I'll bleep it out and put the redacted over my mouth on the episode. It's of course, he was the man who came in, and there's a great. You've probably seen those. It must have been an award show or something with photos of Tom and just embracing, big hugs, big smiles. Clearly liked each other, bonded very quickly and very naturally. So. Good question, and that'll throw a few people, I guarantee it. Because playback, I don't think everyone has playback, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned his name twice there, so make sure you bleep it
I'll
twice.
Bleep it. Excellent. Okay, so we'll throw that up on the socials, of course, and we'll see what people come back with. Okay, thanks for tuning in, folks. Make sure you go and follow John at 444_John on Twitter. And I want to say again, thanks so much for adding your breadth of knowledge and your input to this podcast. It definitely enriches it, and we're getting good feedback from people who say they enjoy these episodes. And again, in an ideal world where neither of us had actual jobs, we could probably just, if we were hiring the hog, we could just do this live in person, and this could be our jobs. This would be such a fun thing to do. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook and Instagram at The Tom Petty Project, and on Twitter at Tom Petty Project, and you can find me on YouTube. Go follow, like, subscribe as applicable, and please leave a rating or a review if you haven't done that already. Until we meet again next week, and that will be an interview episode, which I will announce later because I'm recording those later today. Keep listening to and sharing Tom's music. Try to be kind. Try to say I love you to someone at least once a day. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll be back with you very soon to talk again with John about the next album, which will be Long After Dark. Bye-bye.